Good afternoon. I'm Raleigh Flynn, the president of the Foreign Policy Research Institute. This afternoon, we'll be having a conversation between our Asia Program Director, Jacques deLisle, and Michael C. Davis, who is a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center. We'll be looking at China's autonomous regions, as well as the implications for China's domestic and foreign policy ambitions, as well as what are the Biden administration's options in responding to what's going on. A few housekeeping notes before we get started. If you go to the bottom of your screen, you will see the Q&A box, and we'll be going to questions and answers roughly halfway through the program, so be sure and start adding your questions there. We'll also be showing some links to maps to the area under discussion, so those will be in the chat box. Before I turn it over to Jacques, let me say a few words about Jacques. Jacques is the Stephen A. Cousin Professor of Law and Professor of Political Science and Director of the Center for the Study of Contemporary China at the University of Pennsylvania. His most recent book, To Get Rich is Glorious, Challenges Facing China's Economic Reform and Opening at 40, was co-edited with Avery Goldstein. And his new book, Taiwan Under Tsai, is co-edited with another FPRI fellow, June Teufel-Dreyer, and that is forthcoming. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Jacques. But before I do, also to remind you that we want to thank our supporters, our board, and our donors, many of whom are on this call, as well as to let you know that even though these events are free to you, they're not free to us. So we always encourage you to support us. And if you're not a member, become a member. So without further ado, let me hand the reins over to Jacques deLisle.
Well, thank you, Raleigh. As always, thanks for the introduction, and thank you to everyone who's joining us today. It's a great pleasure to welcome Mike Davis back to FPRI. As Raleigh mentioned, he's currently a Global Fellow at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars, where the Asia program is a frequent partner of ours for Asia-related events at FPRI. He's also a Senior Research Scholar at the Weatherhead Institute, East Asia Institute at Columbia University, and a Professor of Law and International Affairs at the O.P. Jindal Global University in India, just outside Delhi. For many years, he was a professor on the law faculty at the University of Hong Kong, and before that, professor in the Government and Public Administration Department at Chinese University, Hong Kong. He's held distinguished professorships at various law schools and universities around the world, including Notre Dame and Case Western. He writes extensively on issues relating to human rights, constitutionalism, and the rule of law in new democracies and sometimes fragile democracies. He's written a huge amount on Hong Kong, where he's both a scholar and a participant in the many debates of the day over rule of law and possible transitions toward democracy, at least until recently, in Hong Kong. He's also written extensively on human rights issues at China's other frontier, including Tibet and Xinjiang. You can find his work in Foreign Affairs, the Journal of Democracy, many law reviews, edited volumes, solo-authored books, as well as in popular media such as the Washington Post, New York Times, Nikkei, Apple Daily, South China Morning Post. And in that context, he won a Human Rights Press Award from the Hong Kong Journalist Association and the Hong Kong Foreign Correspondents Club. He's also worked with Amnesty International and a variety of other human rights organizations. So a lot in his background that speaks to today's topic, and it's always a great pleasure to see Mike. And part of the occasion for having him in to talk now is he's also got a new book out with the truly depressing title, Making Hong Kong China, The Rollback of Human Rights and the Rule of Law. So we're going to talk today about, as the title of the talk suggests, Hong Kong's autonomous regions, which really come in two principal flavors. There are the special administrative regions along China's southeast coast, Hong Kong, Macau, and at least in Beijing's hoped-for vision, eventually Taiwan. And at the other extreme, there are China, the far west, is home to China's two largest autonomous regions, technically provincial level entities, Tibet and Xinjiang. I used to joke before things turned the way they did recently in Hong Kong that the administrative regions have autonomy and the autonomous regions have administration. But I think at this point, pretty much everybody's feeling a bit of the grasping hand of the central government. So part of what prompted Mike's book and part of what has kept Hong Kong in the news in recent months is the national security law for Hong Kong that China adopted just about a year ago. That was, I think, a pretty stark step down the path of reducing Hong Kong's autonomy, calling into question its rule of law, and extending the central government's control. We actually have that same legislature, the National People's Congress, having its annual session right now, which may bring us some more news. But let's start with the law that caused all the kerfuffle, all the concern about a year ago. So, Mike, what's so bad about the national security law for Hong Kong? What does it imperil or damage?
Well, what I try to do in the book is highlight that it didn't all happen last year. That the agreement over Hong Kong and the basic law for Hong Kong was designed in a way to keep China's finger in the pot. To keep it involved. It held for itself the right to interpret Hong Kong's basic law, and it promised Hong Kong a high degree of autonomy and the ultimate aim of universal suffrage, but at the same time, it drug its heels over that and never really carried out those promises for Hong Kong. So over the years, I mean, one of the things that I think is troubling Hong Kong activists and so on is that the way the story is being presented by Beijing is a bunch of people last year got in on the streets and caused havoc and were engaged in rock throwing and violence and so on. Then Beijing says, of course, we have to come in and fix it. But these people didn't just get up one morning and say, we're going to go on the street. They've been watching over the years as Beijing continuously erodes the high degree of autonomy promised Hong Kong, keeps the ultimate power to decide in its own hands, and then exercises that power from time to time, and especially over the years, exercising that power to deny Hong Kong the promised universal suffrage. And what I have found in my many years in Hong Kong is that people there are very astute. They know that an autonomy regime that's completely under the control of the central government stops being autonomy. It's not autonomy at all. And it's very commonly, I think, understood in Hong Kong that, and I think it was understood by Beijing when it came up with this arrangement, that the rule of law in Hong Kong, in order to be preserved, required this high degree of autonomy, that the mainland system would represent a threat to Hong Kong's rule of law, okay? And so over the years, and so for Hong Kong people, then this ultimate aim of universal suffrage was a way of making sure the autonomous government in Hong Kong would be a government that answered to Hong Kong people and was able to defend Hong Kong's autonomy. Not to be at war with Beijing, but at least to be able to share Hong Kong concerns with Beijing, and that this would allow this very extraordinary model to work, that you would have a liberal constitutional system under this rather hardline authoritarian regime that is China. So this is kind of the precarious situation. But what happened instead is that Beijing would not move forward on those commitments over the years, always kind of manipulating Hong Kong politics. So this was what the situation was in 2019 when all these protests took place, probably at Beijing's encouragement. The chief executive of Hong Kong was putting forth an extradition bill to enable Beijing to get people from Hong Kong extradited to the mainland for trial. And people in Hong Kong were outraged. Now we're going to, be directly subject to the mainland legal system. That's not the rule of law in their view. So people started objecting. They took to the street. Instead of getting a response that was encouraging, they got this response of a very hardline approach by the Hong Kong police, cracking down on them. And this stuff was broadcast all over the world. So this was the situation last year and why people were protesting. In that protest, as in every protest in Hong Kong over the years, they ultimately realized that it's not enough just to address the immediate problem, but ultimately they protest over that promised universal suffrage, that promise of democracy. And they also, because of the circumstances at hand, they wanted the charges against Hong Kong protesters to be dropped and their behavior not to be characterized as riots. So this was the standoff. And instead of listening to any of this, it came down to 5 demands, as Hong Kong people would say, 5 demands, nothing less. Instead of listening to that, and neither the Hong Kong government nor Beijing were in the mood to listen to any Hong Kong requirements. They eventually, as you said last year, on June 30th at 11 p.m., promulgated this national security law. And that law really wreaks havoc on the high degree of autonomy in Hong Kong, because the basic law had promised that mainland departments would not interfere in Hong Kong. And it had promised that mainland laws would not apply except maybe some limited number of national laws, which would be listed in Annex 3. But what Beijing did here instead is they promulgated a law which was, it's national because they promulgated it, but it only applies to Hong Kong. While the basic law had said that Hong Kong on its own would enact laws on secrecy and national security related matters, they instead enacted it in Beijing and didn't even consult Hong Kong. It was imposed that night. We were told that even the chief executive of Hong Kong was very much complicit in Beijing's policies, was not shown this law until it was delivered that day. So this is this circumstance, very confrontational on both sides. And this law pretty much wreaks havoc, as I said, on what this high degree of autonomy, because it sets up a committee on national security in Hong Kong. It's still called Committee on Safeguarding National Security, where the chief executive is on top of it, and all the relevant cabinet members are on this committee. And it's to be advised by a mainland advisor who happens, as it turned out, because this person's been appointed already, to be the head of the local liaison office, which was historically the representative office of the mainland in Hong Kong. Historically, they often expressed their views, but they didn't directly rule Hong Kong. But now suddenly this advisor, as they use the word advisor, but everyone in Hong Kong understands it's kind of a supervisor, because this committee is made subordinate to the Central People's Government. And at the same time, the committee's behavior, it's all its actions in overseeing national security in Hong Kong is not subject to judicial review. It's taken out. In Hong Kong, where the rule of law has long prevailed, judicial review is a central plank in how the rule of the law is carried out under the common law system, which is maintained in Hong Kong. So this committee has pretty much free rein to do whatever it wants. And one of its first acts was to issue a regulation empowering the police. And by the way, the law set up a special branch of the police on national security. And it did the same for the Justice Department in Hong Kong, the prosecutorial wing of the Hong Kong government. And these special branches, under this new regulation that was issued, the police can conduct searches without warrants. It can conduct surveillance and so on. And this all sounds horrible. I mean, no one in Hong Kong would have promoted such a law. But in fact, this isn't the worst part of it. There's an office for safeguarding national security set up in Hong Kong, in which this is totally staffed by the Central People's Government, by people from the mainland Public Security Bureau and State Security and so on. And this office is to have apparently a large number of staff members coming from the mainland, and it's not even subject to local jurisdiction. And it's given the remit to oversee all this national security stuff. And I would add, one of the things that it does, it's obvious if it oversees it and it's not subject to local jurisdiction, that a lot of procedural protections that common law defendants would expect are going to be out of the reign of the court. Well, one of the things it can do is refer a case that's complex to the mainland to be tried on the mainland. So that extradition law that was eventually withdrawn the year before is small potatoes compared to what can happen now, that people can be transferred across the border. And immediately all these things started taking place. It wasn't that they passed the law and that, this is a warning, we're not going to really do all this stuff yet. No, they started doing it right away. On the very first day, July 1st last year, they arrested 10 people. And since then, they've arrested over 100 of them. And most noteworthy, of course, in the past week, they had arrested virtually the entire opposition because they accused them of subversion for conducting a primary election. My God, in Pennsylvania, a primary election would be called subversion. That would horrify us all. But anyhow, this primary election was an attempt by the opposition camp to identify the most worthy candidates to run in what was then a promised legislative council election. And so all of the opposition, entire leadership of a certain generation, the older ones were no longer running for office. And so it's kind of the mid-career politicians were all trying to get seats in this to be the candidate that would run for the pan-democratic camp in the election. All of them were arrested, some 55 of them. And 47 of them were eventually, just this past week on Sunday, charged with subversion, with conspiracy towards subversion. And then a big issue came up whether they would be granted bail. Well, the national security law, unlike the common law in Hong Kong, creates a presumption against bail. And so we all week had these people in court after they were charged on Sunday, trying to, where the court would determine now they have the burden to prove that they're not likely to represent a threat. And so this national security law, this intrusion, the law itself prohibits 4 things: secession, subversion, terrorism, and collusion with foreign forces. But what we've seen, not just in this prosecution I've just mentioned, but across the board, that wherever there's free speech to engage in political speech in Hong Kong, this national security law is present in the way they're applying it. These crimes are all defined in very vague terms. So one of the things that was interesting to me in the past week when we watched all these protests in Myanmar is that Myanmar and Hong Kong were competing for the front page in newspapers around the world. And it's a sad day when a society which just a couple years ago was rated the freest society in the world by the Freedom Forum is now competing with Myanmar's military dictatorship after a coup for media attention for human rights repression. And I would say this is important, and I know Jacques wants to move this along. It's important to appreciate that China already has a pretty bad reputation when it comes to human rights. But in most cases, China is able to control the narrative, at least at home, because of the repression against the press and the control of the press in China. But what we have in the case of Hong Kong, which really makes it an extraordinary case, is this part of China where there's still a press that's reporting on things, and where the international press showed up for this trial, these hearings in court, and where all of this stuff is splashed across the front pages around the world in ways where China doesn't completely have control, although the national security law clearly reflects an attempt to exercise such control. It hasn't been able to go far enough in doing that. So China's reputation is being drugged through the coals every day, and deservedly so.
Yeah, of course, one of the ironies there is that the concentration of sort of high-tier foreign media is especially high in Hong Kong because of the denial of visas and visa renewals to many correspondents who had been based in Beijing and to some extent in Shanghai, and China wouldn't let them stay, so now they're all hanging out in Hong Kong covering that story. So that's a terrific overview of a very complex set of issues that bedevil the Hong Kong Special Administrative Region these days. And I think there are really sort of 3 interrelated strands that run through it. One is the substantive offenses, which, as you say, are vague and can catch almost anyone who's a remotely pro-democracy or even perhaps pro-rule of law person in their net, and in principle can extend extraterritorially. That was another thing that the National
didn't mention, of course,
drew a lot of criticism for. So the sort of expansive substantive roles, the one of collusion with foreigners, particularly troubling because that's been one of Hong Kong's special traits, and it's been one of the ways that liberal values have been kept alive in Hong Kong is by this connection to the outside world. So there's that strand. Then there is the strand you told us a great deal about of the erosion of institutional autonomy, right? The Hong Kong courts no longer having full jurisdiction, the special police force, the special national security committee and so on, these things that essentially breach that wall of autonomy promised in the Joint Declaration, the Treaty for Hong Kong's Return, and the Basic Law. And then there is this anti-democratic strain. And I want to probe that last one a little bit. Among the sort of threads that weave together here as kind of an attack on democracy in Hong Kong are, first of all, that those people who were arrested are by and large people who are part of the pan-democratic movement and who have been advocates for expanding toward universal suffrage as originally promised. But we've also seen the postponement of the elections, which were supposed to be held this fall, ostensibly because of COVID. And now we have a statement that only patriotic people can hold elected positions or even appointed positions in the Hong Kong government. And so you can't run for office if you're unpatriotic. And we've seen among the people targeted, the people elected to the district councils was a real democratic sweep in the most recent elections held in Hong Kong for the most basic level positions. So, and as you say, the primary over the summer is the sort of informal primary to figure out who the Pandems wanted to be their candidates was what has led to a lot of the arrests. So, so how much of this, how do you relate the sort of democracy issue to the autonomy issue? And I guess the underlying question is also, Beijing has had these views for a while. And as you know as well as anybody, there's a long story of pushback against calls from Hong Kong for moving more rapidly forward with universal suffrage, right? We've seen the umbrella movement ultimately from about 7 years ago now was about the question of how soon they go to universal suffrage with possibly open nominations for the chief executive. The democracy demand got added in 2019 to what was initially a complaint about the extradition law. So the anti-democratic strain has been there for a while. The discontent with what's going on in Hong Kong has been there for a while. Why do you think it ratcheted up so much in the last couple of years? I mean, I take your point completely. This is not new, but it has been since 2019, a particularly bleak moment. Why now?
Well, I think a lot of it is Xi Jinping. I mean, he's not a liberal. He's obviously, I mean, he's extended his own term on the mainland, his right to carry on. He's seems to feel beleaguered that he has to repress any source of opposition in China. So I think Hong Kong is caught up in the larger picture. It's an unfortunate thing because China, by showing at least limited restraint, has been able to have one of perhaps the 3 most prominent cities in the world in its country available to its enterprises and so on to carry. Hong Kong fights, as they say, way above its weight. And so it had this extraordinary city, but at the same time, of course, it was horrified by the protest. And so how did they get into such a confrontation, I guess is what your question begs. And I've often thought that one of their problems is China doesn't know how to run an open society. It just rarely, it imagines it does, imagined it did, but it didn't really. And so it put its favored people in charge of Hong Kong all these years. It allowed popular participation through the Legislative Council and these district council positions, but for the most part had control over who was in charge. It has a committee that elects the chief executive, and the committee, China has carefully made sure, is made up of mostly people who are what they call pro-Beijing. So if under this design, you would think, you would hope that these pro-establishment, pro-Beijing figures that run Hong Kong would have exercised some forethought and think about how to convey to Beijing what an open society, what a major city like Hong Kong would require. And we haven't seen that. So when I think about who dropped the ball the most, I see a lot of that in the establishment camp in Hong Kong. Of course, no one would have expected them to be opposing Beijing. Most of them hold the positions they hold at Beijing's, privilege. But at the same time, to be able to convey concerns about the rule, how to maintain the rule of law, how to run an open society, why these institutions that are all laid out in the basic law, and they were laid out in the Sino-British Treaty returning Hong Kong, why these institutions are important, and so that Hong Kong people would be able to perceive that this system was responsive to their needs and that they were capable of guarding Hong Kong's autonomy. They've never done that. They apparently always felt that the more you can sound like Beijing, the more you can say Beijing what Beijing wants to hear, the more you'll get promoted. And so this is very unfortunate. I think it created all of this circumstance so that the people of Hong Kong felt threatened, that there was no effective means of guarding their autonomy. I've written myself saying that, while the courts were part of it, courts were part of the ability to guard the autonomy because they would guard things like freedom of speech, taking what they called using common law standards, a purposive approach to human rights and so on. So the courts were very important. And the only other guardian has been the street, civil society. So the absence of this establishment camp of elites that were cultivated by Beijing, their voice has been missing in really representing Hong Kong. And I think that's why we've got into this mess. And so then as it unfolds and it gets worse and worse, it's like a snowball rolling down a hill, then China resorts to its own methods. And its own methods are repression. That's the only way it knows how to maintain stability and order, is through repression. And so what we saw in the last couple of years, especially after the 2019 protest, which was China was labeling a color revolution and all of that, even though the demands were all demands to comply with the basic law. After that protest, Beijing, I guess, perceives it's the only way to use its methods and bring this under control is the repressive policies we've seen. And they didn't have to send in the People's Liberation Army. They managed to turn the police into the Public Security Bureau for Hong Kong. And the police have very much carried out Beijing's wishes with enthusiasm, as has the Hong Kong government.
Okay, so just to clarify a bit of the context for perhaps the non-Hong Kong junkies in our audience, this all goes back in some ways, well, of course, in some ways it goes back to the 19th century. We won't do that. But the joint declaration, the UK PRC, the British-Chinese agreement on returning Hong Kong to Chinese rule includes this pledge of autonomy and continuity, right? Significant local autonomy and continuity in the legal, economic, and social systems and so on. And then the basic law is a deeply entrenched mini constitution from Hong Kong's perspective. Hong Kongers can't change the basic law, but it is ultimately a statute adopted by the National People's Congress for governing Hong Kong. And what Mike's been detailing are the ways in which recent moves and not so recent moves are vulnerable to criticism for not fulfilling those promises, for eroding judicial autonomy, for not moving forward with democratization, and one could add for not protecting the commitment to international human rights. The two covenants, principal UN human rights covenants, are brought into Hong Kong law, and the courts have been a part of doing that. So one of the other things that's possibly on the agenda is the so-called Lianghui, the two meetings are going on in Beijing this week. And as Mike points out, the national security law last summer was not the full session. That was a standing committee meeting. But there is talk of possible amendment to the basic law coming out of the current round of the NPC, which would really be a pretty radical move if that were to happen, wouldn't it? And if the goal is to, as some reports indicate, to further truncate Hong Kong's democracy, whether it's changing the election rules or perhaps making the constrained nomination process we see for chief executive candidates who have to be vetted by a pro-Beijing group, whether that's extended to legislative candidates or something. Where do you think Beijing is going to go with that? And is there a reason for doing formal amendment rather than simply doing the interpretations or passing the parallel laws like the national security law that they've done so far? What should we be worried about on that front?
Well, it's hard to know whether they do formal amendment. I've argued in the book you mentioned, I argue that the national security law, in effect, was an amendment of the basic law. It has equal status as a national law to the Hong Kong basic law, and superior because it's more specific and more recent. And so, and we know the Court of Final Appeal, the first time it's had to make a ruling on this in a recent bail case involving a prominent publisher in Hong Kong, Jimmy Lai, openly said that the national security law takes precedence over the basic law. So this is the problem. And what now we're going to see, we're either going to see them just issue some ruling or guide or law, who knows, maybe actually use an amendment procedure because there are no more Democrats in the Legislative Council, so they could use the formal amendment procedure in the basic law itself. But they can't, what they're talking about doing, it wouldn't be enough just to interpret what's there, because they're going to so profoundly violate the basic law. Of course, because the rule of law itself is now in question, it's hard to know whether it matters how they do it. Because what they're talking about doing is controlling and making sure only what they call patriots hold any positions in Hong Kong. So while they arrested what they consider to be the unpatriotic pan-Democrats in this case we've been talking about, virtually the entire active political community of the pan-Democrats. And a footnote here, we have to bear in mind the pan-Dems are not just a minority party in a sense. They've won every election in Hong Kong since the handover. They get about 55 to 60% of the vote in direct votes. The electoral system is so stacked in Beijing's favor that they don't hold the majority in the Legislative Council when they have these elections, but they always win more votes in direct elections from Hong Kong people. So it seems that China has taken the view that Beijing leaders, and Mr. Xiao Baolong, who's the guy in charge now of Hong Kong affairs, made very clear that these pan-Dems are not patriots, and they therefore they're going to change the thing to block them. And some of the proposals have been to create a special committee to vet candidates. Right now, the candidates have been excluded anyhow because officials in the Hong Kong electoral office have denied certain candidates that have tried to run the right to run. They've not been cleared because they've been judged to have done something unpatriotic or that the government objects to. So basically, they not only arrest all the pan-Dems pretty much now that are politically active, but they're going to make sure in the future that none of them, that people who oppose the government can't run. After Beijing had authorized the dismissal of 4 legislators in the Legislative Council, which is the highest legislative body, a few months ago, and then the rest of the pan-Dems quit in protest. So Carrie Lam, after this happened, says, "Oh, now the Legislative Council is much better. We can really get business done." I'm sure Joe Biden would like that too if he had no opposition. Can get business done. Of course, I'm sure he won't like it because he's a Democrat. But anyhow, that's their view. So get rid of all the opposition people and to vet them. It's kind of like the Guardian Council in Iran to exclude anybody who opposes the government from actually holding legislative offices or district council offices and so on. They're also district council now participates in the committee that elects the chief executive. That is also proposed to be stopped. So all of this is kind of going to be done secretly in Beijing instead of asking the Hong Kong to enact laws as it would normally be the case up until now. So we don't know what form it will take, but it seems certain to exclude a kind of free political competition in Hong Kong.
Okay, we've got a bunch of questions coming to the Q&A, and I want to have time to get to them, but let's spend a little bit of time on the other fringe of the PRC's territory, which are the Xinjiang, of course, has been hugely in the news in the last year plus for the essentially so-called re-education camps, but what are essentially internment camps, and along with that, a form of essentially cultural genocide and relocating people to work outside the area. Tibet's a long-term issue as well. It's been somewhat more quiet lately. But in theory, both Xinjiang and Tibet exist under a special autonomy regime, right? They're autonomous regions where ostensibly there's much more accommodation of difference, self-governance to some degree and all of that, but not really how it's been playing out on the ground. So what do you see as are there similarities to what's going on in Hong Kong, or some of the same motivations underlying it? I guess I'd pose the same question that I did about Hong Kong, which is why now, particularly with Xinjiang?
Yeah, well, again, it seems to be the same thing. Some people speculated, well, Beijing is doing this because of COVID. It's basically trying to change the topic, and it's taking advantage of preoccupation around the world with the pandemic. We don't know, one can speculate why that. I think it all comes down to really just a belief in authoritarianism. You have to bear in mind right now, there's a kind of global competition between democracies and authoritarian regimes. We know the Freedom Forum just issued a report this week saying that the last 15 years, there's been a decline in the number of democracies and an increase in authoritarian regimes. And in some ways, Beijing is leading the charge. So it's trying to bring legitimacy and validity to its hardline policies. And it seems brazen in doing so. It's willing, Xi Jinping seems willing to do whatever he can get away with in this regard. And so I know the next series of questions from our participants will be, what can we do about it? But this is kind of, I think, the climate in which this is occurring.
Before go ahead.
Yeah.
So before we get to the what can we do about it question, there's one from Bob Kaplan in our Q&A thing, I think is worth speaking to, which is, of course, China is not a monolith. Xi Jinping exercises a great deal of power. But what signs do we have about debates within China about whether it's a good idea to take the hardline policy we've seen toward Hong Kong and toward Xinjiang?
Jacques, you're as knowledgeable as I am, but my impression is that Xi Jinping is carefully trying to silence those debates. Once in a while, we get some leakage suggesting that some people have their backs up, but it's hazardous to speak out. Just as the Hong Kong example is so educating in a way, because it shows in open reporting what speaking out gets you. It gets you arrested, it gets you in trouble, where most of us here on this side of the Pacific looking at China or looking from a distance, and there's control over how much information we get. So I think there must be. I mean, we know historically China's had elements of the leadership that are reform-minded, and we see this in universities and professors. But we're also seeing a pushback against them when they try to criticize, or if they criticize the leadership, the direction that things are taking. Professors or whoever they are, they find themselves in hot water and get punished. So I think just like we're seeing in this open debate in Hong Kong and the arrest of almost the entire opposition, that on the mainland it's even more hazardous to speak out against Xi. So it's really not clear whether there's any lurking behind all of this opaque system, whether there are significant numbers of people who would really push back and may change the narrative. Right now, we're not seeing it.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, Xi has consolidated power, I think, more than people would have thought when he first came to power. He clearly has a degree of concentration in his hands and a silencing of people within the party elites because of the anti-corruption drive being turned against them and some personnel moves and essentially postponing the question of a successor, both by extending his own term limits and by having a Politburo standing committee which has no one who's looking like a designated successor. I think if you broaden it to the sort of policy, sometime advisors, broader public intellectuals, the thing that struck me in recent years is the liberals are still there. The reformers are still there. It's just they feel they don't have an audience. They don't have the kind of entree and access. And and there is a lot of contempt for Xi, but not among people who can do much about it. But some of the critique is almost a tactical critique. That is, this is a stupid thing to be doing. By taking the hard line you only make people in Xinjiang even angrier and more radicalized. By taking the line you're taking in Hong Kong, you risk damaging the remaining economic value of Hong Kong and bringing down this kind of international opprobrium. And it seems that the response is, well, that's kind of baked in. You know, the world's already really ticked off at China for its behavior. So do you think that's some of what's going on here? I mean, one of the questions in the chat box is, why would China even care about being accused of violating the Joint Declaration? And one could add violating international human rights, be they customary or treaty-based, and China signed on to one of the covenants, but not the other. Does that argument really matter or have any suasion with the people who are making the decisions in China now?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know, but I think it does, in spite of everything. It's a paradox. The rest of us look from outside and see this all-powerful leadership, but apparently the leadership is very insecure, or they wouldn't be arresting people. They wouldn't be trying to silence all of the communities in the periphery and assimilate them. And we know Canada and the United States accuse them of genocide. They wouldn't be doing these things if they were confident in their position. Rather, they seem to feel a threat. So maybe they see more of a threat than we do. And I think that's probably why they do what they do. But I think that they've engaged us in a much broader level than these individual cases suggest now, because there's concern about China model being used abroad, and China supporting countries that are similar in their attitude towards their political opposition. So it's a much bigger debate, I think, going on now. But I think they care. Beijing Olympics, for example, is just one example of how they care. We know the last time around, they cared a lot. They even cared so much that they met with the Tibetans, even though they did nothing that the Tibetans wanted. They basically put on a show that they wanted to have a dialogue with the Dalai Lama because they wanted the Beijing Olympics to go smoothly. They have a lot of faith invested in that. They do invest in trying to develop soft power, even while they seem very poor at it, actually doing it. So they apparently care, and they apparently feel threatened. I think these two things are both on the table at once. So we'll have to see where it leads us.
In part of your prior answer, you said, I think rightly, that our audience wants to know what we can, should, and are doing about it. So is there, what kind of leverage can the U.S. and other democracies, perhaps in the region, do to affect the situation? We've certainly seen efforts in that direction. We have the U.S. Hong Kong Policy Act goes way back to right around the time of reversion, saying we're going to monitor what's going on in Hong Kong. We've got the Human Rights Democracy Hong Kong Protection Act, which calls for sanctions. We've had the Trump administration talk quite tough on China on these issues. Biden has promised to put human rights and values back nearer the center of U.S. foreign policy. So there's a bunch there that seems at least to dovetail with the agenda you're talking about, and some of it is quite explicit about putting pressure on China over Hong Kong, and there are parallel examples one could cite about Xinjiang. So are we doing the right thing, and how much prospect for impact does it have?
Well, I think one of the things that we're seeing in the shift of administrations, which seems important, at least perhaps the wisdom we acquired, the approach of the Trump administration was very vocal and put China on the front page in many ways in U.S. foreign policy. But at the same time, the U.S. came across as a bit hypocritical because of it didn't seem that it was really committed to the same kinds of human rights that it wanted China to adhere to, and then sometimes waffled on that if there was a trade deal to be had. So I think a couple things that we've seen in the Biden administration that I think are more hopeful. I think because this debate is global, and the things that Freedom Forum is telling us about, how many democracies are surviving, and I think something like 20% of the countries in the world are democracies. So it's a real life or death struggle for democracy going on in the world. So one of the things that I think they've talked about, and I hope they do, is that Biden wants to have a democracy forum of some sort. He seems like he's targeting the improvement of U.S. democracy We saw House Bill number 1 the other day being passed that would try to clean up voter rights and so on. So I think we shouldn't be so focused on China that we don't realize that this is a bigger competition and we have to get our own act together. He also talks about reaching out to allies, so forming a kind of more united position on things. So I think these are sort of fundamental to being able to make anything that you do directly targeting these difficulties like Xinjiang or the genocide allegations in there, or issues over Tibet, or issues over Hong Kong. We need to have specific policies. I know there's a kind of safe harbor act now being discussed in Congress, because if we can't persuade Beijing to modify its approach to Hong Kong in a positive way, then probably there's going to be a need to open our door to immigration more from Hong Kong. The UK has done this, and the US is probably going to have to do more of this as well. And so the other thing that's going on is sanctions. They're so-called targeted sanctions. So if we are operating in a way that works with our allies and also, carries out our own democratic project at home in a respectable way, then we can talk about these other more targeted tools. And so when it comes to sanctions, how do you impose a cost? If all you say is Carrie Lam can't come to the United States, that's not going to change the Hong Kong policy. So it's going to probably involve a lot more thought about whether they do want to set up things that have economic consequences for companies that support this kind of crackdown in Hong Kong, or for companies that produce goods from people who are under forced labor and so on. I think there's going to have to be a lot of thinking about that, and we're going to have to walk and chew gum at the same time. We're going to have to look at some of the weaknesses that have emerged in our own reputation and our own influence in the world, and then at the same time look at whether there are ways that we can persuade Beijing to do things differently, either through pressure or a convincing argument where economic advantage and so on come with policies that we would like to see.
So there are a few things in the Q&A function that I think speak to that point that I'll try to draw together here. And I would put them in the category of why does China get cut breaks in a way that Russia doesn't, or why are we not seeing more of a Cold War kind of approach to China? And is the answer to that kind of the skeptics or critics' response to what you just said, which is to say the economic relationship, that it is perhaps a source of leverage because of the economic interest, we are interdependent and maybe some sanctions at work, or is it a source of weakness because we're not willing to take the economic hits that would come from taking a tougher line?
Yeah, I think, of course, you put right on the target, and I'm sure the questioner understood that as well, that China is not the Soviet Union. China's economy is, I think, more vibrant in many ways because it basically opened up to free market capitalism. Now, there are weaknesses in that now. That in the early years, there was an attempt to privatize the economy and encourage companies, like Alibaba and others, to develop and take leadership in the world, where the trend under Xi Jinping has been to move back more towards state-owned enterprises and decisions that are guided as much by politics as economics. And so that means how you deal with that and how you leverage economic disputes is going to be different than it was with the Soviet Union, because at least on the economic front, China is a diverse place. And so how do you win over support? Obviously, it's carrots and sticks. You make advantages to people who are doing what you want. You offer advantages, and perhaps sticks are involved where they're not doing what you want. I mentioned that a moment ago in the Hong Kong context. So I think in some ways it's a much more complicated problem because we're more integrated with China. But at the same time, it could involve supporting or encouraging American companies to relocate to other areas in the world where they can gain similar advantages without supporting these hardline policies. So there's a lot of, I just think it's a much more complicated on an economic front relationship, and all these things have to be there. So if we're doing the other things I mentioned in terms of having a credible position at the table, perhaps one that's where our soft power is maximized and global support is attracted, then we have that kind of leverage. Maybe some of it will be very much like the carrot. Beijing perhaps can see advantages to supporting a value system that the global community has generated. But in other ways, it could be putting pressure where pressure is needed to bring about change. So I wish there was a magic wand here, but it's a complicated thing. It's unlikely we're going to see Beijing just cut off from the world. Its economic presence is too large. So it's a lot of little things that have to be done to encourage and keep these issues that we started our conversation with today up front and center in any of these policy areas, whether it's trade and aid or international finance, all kinds of other issues.
So building a bit on a comment from my Penn colleague, Marshall Meyer, part of the issue here is the U.S. business community, which has still sees significant opportunities in China, and particularly commitments to open up financial sector and things like that. And it seems that one of the really remarkable and complicating developments over the last 10 years, maybe a bit more, is the shift in that position, right? The business community was all for China engagement. You bring China into the world, great business opportunities, make it more market friendly, hopefully socialize it into behavior. And it's gotten to be really, really messy and complicated, because on the one hand, you now have businesses complaining bitterly about unfair practices in China, sometimes getting shareholder pressure about being involved in questionable labor standards and things like that. Lots of complaints about intellectual property, lots of complaints about favoritism toward Chinese firms and industrial policy and that sort of thing, which all has taken away one of the supporting pillars of not being tougher or more confrontational on China. Yet at the same time, and we saw this a lot, I think, in the Trump administration, the fear that we would accelerate decoupling and that would really, be quite costly. And we now see in the most recent draft 5-year plans and in some of the discussion going on at the National People's Congress meeting right now, this emphasis on tech self-sufficiency in China. So the influence of that quite powerful constituency on what U.S. policy should be, I think, has gotten a lot messier. We're getting pretty close to the end of our time here, so there's two other themes that are in a lot of the questions that I want to weave in and get your view on. One is quite suited to your research interests, which is Taiwan. And we've talked about how China Beijing has taken a much tougher line on Hong Kong in the last couple of years and has cracked down there, the national security law, the arrests, all the things we spent the first part of our time on. Xinjiang, a human rights horror story, which has gotten far worse in the last year or two. But Chinese rhetoric toward Taiwan has gotten a bit tougher too. Do you see a ratcheting up of Chinese pressure on Taiwan, and with what effect? Is it a potential war? Is it at least a source of great crisis in the region, or is this going to be sort of farther over the horizon?
Just taking off first from your comments right before the question about business and so on, I would say, when we talk about keeping our eye on the target, the Hong Kong, I would argue, has been a major advantage for international business doing business in China, not just because when needed and when they had the power to do so, they could use Hong Kong for resolving disputes and take advantage of Hong Kong's rule of law. A lot of money, a lot of stock market investment, everything passing through Hong Kong. But also because Hong Kong often became a model for law reform in China. And so when Hong Kong is degraded in the way it is, businesses are really losing a great resource in dealing and doing business in China. So I think this is something that sometimes is underappreciated. And so it may be that Hong Kong, that international businesses that do business with Hong Kong, so international businesses could work together to push back a bit against the extreme policies that are going on now. And so all of this, of course, has an impact on Taiwan. It means on the ground in Taiwan, no one's interested in having one country, two systems. They haven't been for years because what I mentioned at the beginning of our talk today, that this erosion of Hong Kong's autonomy is a long established problem. And now the situation is so bad that they would have no interest. China seems to be hinting or threatening to invade Taiwan. It's been placing missiles strategically for years, and its expenditure on its military resources have gone up over the years. So there's at least speculation that the U.S. Defense arrangements could be inadequate, or maybe the U.S. would be unwilling to go to defend them. So I think that there's all of that on the table. We see some of it playing out in lesser ways in the South China Sea as China projects its power there. And so it would seem that the U.S., if the U.S. sees this all as a package, then it really can't afford to sit on the sidelines. And so if Taiwan is threatened, I suppose the U.S. has to be there. In the past, there was a kind of ambiguity about whether the U.S. would be there, but I think that is not probably not acceptable anymore. So I think we're going to see more of a sort of assertive U.S. position there. I think with Trump, it was a lot louder, that position. But with Biden, I don't see them changing that. I think that they're not going to be as loud. They're going to be more, measured in how they present themselves on these issues. But they're going to be, I think, some maintenance of more and more sort of confrontation with China. And so Taiwan is in the middle of all of that.
And of course, we saw early in the Biden administration, the State Department statement that the relationship with Taiwan is rock solid, and we saw the Taiwan representative, the ambassador equivalent, who was on our show a few weeks ago, invited to the inauguration. So there's certainly a lot of signaling being sent. We're almost up against time, but there's one more question I want to get in here because it's been in a few of the chat questions, which is we've been talking about external pressure primarily from the U.S. on China and whether it would have any effect. With respect to Xinjiang, one of the notable features has been the relative silence of the Islamic world. The Saudis, the neighboring countries in Central Asia, I mean, Turkey, a brief moment of saying something, but why such little interest for co-religious, and do you see anything that would change the absence of pressure on China from Islamic countries?
Well, I would hope that Biden's interest in strengthening alignments might mean that there's an advantage to pushing back on some of these issues. I think under Trump, there was a sense that a lot of these countries would be abandoned, and America First policy, where I think now we're going back to multilateralism. Perhaps there can be, these countries need not feel that, because if they're too reliant on China for international investment and aid and so on, then of course they're not going to be willing to speak out and lose those advantages. So this will be a challenge of the current administration to encourage confidence in being able to have support of the United States, Western Europe, and so on, which again requires multilateral approaches.
Well, we've covered a great deal of ground here, certainly all along both of China's principal peripheral areas. I want to thank Mike Davis for a terrific conversation today. I want to thank you all for joining us. I'll just close with a couple of things. We have two more near-term installments in our series of Thursdays at 2 talks on China and its engagement with the world. We have Egg Freeman next week on One Belt, One Road, China's Power Meets the World. It's a new book he has coming out from Harvard University Press. And then the week after that, March 18th, Thursday at 2, we'll have Alex Long of UCLA Law School. We'll be talking about cooperation and competition in managing climate change between the US and China. He's got some interesting views on how much that is competitive and how much that is cooperative and where it will take us. So I hope you'll join us for both of that. I hope you've enjoyed today's program. If you missed it, or missed part of it, or want to tell your friends about it, it's posted on the FPRI website. We're grateful for your joining us, and we'd be even more grateful if you'd offer us your support. You can go to the website to find out how to become a member or a supporter of FPRI. And once again, thanks to Mike, because he's the kind of person who makes these sessions possible and gives us content to deliver to all of you. And thank you for your questions and for listening today. We'll see you soon.